It is autumn, and apropos of nothing other than the fact that I've already talked my face off about the Halloween franchise and charted its fractured universe timeline, um, I'm going to go ahead and keep going with the original big three slashers of the 80s that kind of kicked off a whole new mythology of horror films. This week, I'm doing Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street because they both do connect at the bottom with Freddy vs. Jason. Um, Friday the 13th is a franchise very, very dear to my heart. While I will acknowledge that they're all complete pieces of shit, the movies are, it's total lowbrow, capitalist, cynical filmmaking at its best, which means that it's pop cinema at its best. Um, Pop cinema, is basically enslaved to trends and tapping into them until they are completely drained, and then we move on to the next trend. Halloween made a huge, huge, huge splash in 1979. Sean S. Cunningham called up Victor Miller one day and said, "Hey, the Halloween franchise, or Halloween is making a lot of money. Why don't we rip it off?" That is how Friday the 13th was born, and that is precisely how seriously any of us are allowed to take this franchise. It's goofy, wonky, none of it makes any sense, no thought went into it, definitely no love, no care. All of that love and care was invested in it by the fan base. And, the youth of the 80s, there was something about these films that hooked us, much to the chagrin of the grown-ups in the world, who thought that we were just obsessed with death and maybe our own death, which is true, but not in the negative Freudian death fetish way that I think the critics of the 80s were so scared of. Serial killings were a very new thing back then, and just this idea that nowhere you could go in America, no suburb was safe enough to protect you from this new, random, nasty, awful form of violence that was becoming as American as baseball and apple pie, really. So, Friday the 13th, let's start here. Of course, in the original film, it doesn't take place in a supernatural universe. It's a mystery, it's a whodunit, and one that plays very, very unfair with its audience, in that the killer is not any of the characters in the film. You don't ever have a chance to guess who it is. This random person shows up in the third act and goes, "Hey, I'm this new character, and by the way, I'm the killer." Even back then, I saw Friday when I was like 8, I think, and I loved it, and I loved it for the gore, and the gore alone, for the shock value, for the scare factor, for that jump scare at the end, of course. That was a fucking life changer for a lot of us. But when Mrs. Voorhees showed up at the end, I remember going, "I call bullshit!" even as an 8-year-old. But here it is. And then Jason comes back to life in part 2, for reasons totally unexplained, and are not clear at all. We're never really sure, like, did he actually drown? Did he come back to life somehow? And if so, why is he still aging? Why isn't he just a zombie kid? If he didn't actually drown, then why is it so hard for him to be killed? You don't have a Dr. Loomis character in this franchise to explain to you what Jason is, which is all the more maddening, and kind of all the more fun in its way. So Friday, we've got grown-up Jason, basically as a low-rent version of Michael Myers, and it's stuck. He is every bit as iconic as Michael Myers these days. Even if he doesn't have a right to be, we're stuck with him. I love him. Of course I love Michael Myers more, but only the original Michael Myers as portrayed by Nick Castle in the original Halloween. Part 3 has nothing to do with summer camp. None of the characters are really even aware of the killings that went down in the first couple of movies. Well, part 2 is a Friday the 13th, so this is technically Saturday the 14th, Friday 3. Happens, I think, the next day, or at least a couple days later. But the characters who come to the rental house in the movie, They've never heard of Jason. No one ever says Jason's name, and there's no reason why the final girl would have a dream sequence of Mrs. Voorhees coming out of the water at the end, because she has no idea who the fuck he is. So this is the one film that you could take out of the franchise, and it wouldn't have an effect. Nothing really moves forward in Part 3, except for the fact that Jason gets a hockey mask. Part 4, the final chapter. Man, what a special movie. This one I really, really attached to as a kid. The first 5 in general, like those are the ones that I grew up with and have that heart resonance for me. And Part 4, they became aware, I guess, finally, that little kids were sneaking into these movies. And they gave us somebody that we could identify with. Tommy Jarvis. What an amazing character. This was it was the highest class version or sequel that had been made so far in terms of production value. Paramount, I think, yeah, they put their name on this one. It wasn't a negative pickup. They got some really higher caliber actors than they normally did. They took it seriously while simultaneously being totally unapologetic about what this film is, what these films were, which are exploitation. And so you have a film that works completely as an exploitation slasher film, but also has characters that you kind of sort of care about, and a little kid, you know, and this kid gets put in a very, very dangerous situation, and given the fact that he kills a kid in a wheelchair in Part 2, a pregnant girl in Part 3, you definitely believe that fucking kid is in danger in Part 4, unlike Part 6. We'll get to that later. So Part 4 is the beginning of what is called the Tommy Jarvis trilogy. But for me, Part 4 and Part 5, they're not a straight line. Story-wise, they are. This one it goes into it still feels like it's part of this universe. And for me, my headcanon ends at Part 5. I just love that ending. The film itself is handled very strangely. Again, it's a very unapologetic exploitation movie with a very, very high body count and a very high boobie count, and no complaints about that whatsoever. It's just really fucking goofy and poorly thought out. You can't complain. I can't complain too much about that because, like I said, this franchise exists. It's fueled by pure pop culture cynicism. It's riding this trend and just milking everything out of it until it's done. And it exists solely to rip off Halloween. So, yeah, I personally didn't have much of a problem with where Part 5 went. A lot of people did, and a lot of people prefer Part 6 to Part 5. And 6 to me is just kind of a retcon of 5. There are a few things complaints that I have about it that back in the day, of course, you know, as an adolescent, I wouldn't have been able to articulate. But after years and years of sitting with these movies and thinking about them, gaining some age and wisdom and reflecting on what those films must have meant to me back then, Part 6, it changes, again, the way that the Rob Zombie Halloween reboots did, the archetypal essence of Jason's character. I've said in the previous video that he's more of a werewolf, Phantom of the Opera kind of an archetype, nurture as opposed to nature. Part 6 turns him into a Frankenstein monster, basically, reanimated by electricity, and now kind of a zombie, an immortal zombie character. Much more of a monster than a slasher, although he still uses all the implements. So there's something about that, the reworking of his archetypal essence, that rang hollow to me back then. I couldn't have told you why. And the film is also, you know, much more overtly comedic than any of the first 5, which is fine. Much more overtly gothic. Tom McLoughlin wanted to bring some class to this film, and also kind of wink at the audience and go like, hey guys, I know these movies are pieces of shit and I'm doing the best I can with this one, okay? And that worked with the critics. Part 6 is maybe the most critically acclaimed film in the entire franchise. Most of those reviews still said things like, you can't hate a movie that's making fun of itself. And again, that was one of the things that turned me off about the film. Was like it was so apologetic about what it was. Why be what you are if you're just gonna fucking apologize for it the entire time? Make a different movie, for fuck's sake. So yeah, the gothic underpinnings, the humor, I just wasn't on board with it, and I'm still really not. The film has aged pretty well, and I'm not gonna, fault any fans who cite this as their favorite, and there are a lot of them out there. For me, it's 4, far and away. Part 7 is a direct sequel to Part 6. Oh, also, going back here, another thing I love about Part 5 is Tommy Jarvis is genuinely troubled and clearly traumatized, and it's very much about him trying to just get on with his life and not being able to, having to confront this trauma all over again. It's a great idea that is very, very clumsily handled by somebody who was probably on a lot of cocaine at the time, but I still love Part 5. Part 6, Tommy just kind of starts off as he's just normal and heroic, Maybe a little bit his troubled nature comes up in the beginning of the film after he digs up Jason and looks at him for the first time in his coffin, but that's about it. Other than that, he's just a good guy trying to beat Jason, and just a much blander character, if you ask me. So yeah, that whole traumatic aspect of his character, traumatized aspect of his character, is really ignored, which to me feels very disrespectful and highly unrealistic. And also in Part 6, it's the first time that Camp Crystal Lake actually opens for the kids. The kids show up, and you think, oh my god, the stakes are going to be so much higher, and they're really just not. The film's tone is so light that you don't believe for a second that any of the kids camping at Camp Crystal Lake are in any danger, and that's a bummer too. Part 7, John Buechler comes on board as director. Not from so much of a gothic background as McLaughlin, more from a comic book background, and that definitely shows. He wants to make it into more of a fantasy comic booky type of thing, because he also didn't have any respect for the slasher genre. Which, get the fuck out, why are you here? I will say, as a makeup artist, his Jason, while not my favorite Jason, this is my favorite Jason here, particularly the 3 and 4, Richard Brooker and Ted White. Damn, they fucking nailed it. I'm not fond of Jason as a character in this film, and I'm not very fond of his look as compared to the looks in 3 and 4. But it's Buechler's best work visually as a makeup artist. Normally, all of his earlier stuff, Ghoulies and his work in From Beyond, I always found to be a little bit lumpy and misshapen and kind of underdeveloped. I've never really thought much of him as a makeup effects artist or a director. But his Jason is probably his best work. Jason Takes Manhattan, again, these go into like fractured jumps in timelines in universes because they just feel so different, and the rules change from movie to movie. In Part 6, it was, you have to just return Jason to the place where he died, and everything will be okay. Except that it's not. In Part 7, a telekinetic girl who also inexplicably has not only visions of the future, and can move objects with her mind, but can bring the dead back to life. So maybe she was a virgin birth. Maybe she's the second coming or something. Those are some really fucking serious powers. And that's how, apparently, Jason gets brought back to life in Part 7. He goes back to the bottom of Crystal Lake and is again brought back to life by electricity in Jason Takes Manhattan. And now he's apparently a ghost who can teleport or revert back to his childhood form. Weirdly not hydrocephalic. I think the implication is that he was somehow made deformed from drowning and being in the lake for so long, which is fucking bullshit. And of course, even though he's a supernatural ghost now, he can be killed by toxic waste. Okay. Alternate timeline, I assume, from Part 7, or maybe totally unrelated. I don't know. Jason is back at Camp Crystal Lake and roaming around killing teenagers. at the very beginning before he is blown to pieces and then becomes a body-jumping demon. So, yeah, again, his mythology has changed, and the way to kill him has changed. Only a Voorhees can kill a Voorhees, whatever. And he ends up in hell at the end. Now, Nightmare on Elm Street. Looking at this now and what I did with the Halloween chart, I think I'm going to redo it and have New Nightmare kind of encompass Elm Street and possibly Dream Warriors. Because it definitely exists in it's a meta sequel that exists in a world where Elm Street is just a movie. And I'm going to assume Dream Warriors is as well, because that was Craven approved and starring Heather Langenkamp as well. So just pretend there's a box around these two with New Nightmare. Elm Street. They tried Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, which was the beginning of Freddy turning into a stand-up comedian, delivering one-liners before and after he kills people. It's the black sheep sequel in the franchise that is completely ignored by everything else. Looking back with hindsight, we can see this movie for what it is now, which is kind of an unconscious treatise on 80s gay panic, and that one makes it one of the more interesting films in the franchise. But it got left in the dust immediately by this continuity here with Alice and Tina and Alice and Lisa. I forget who these characters are. I really didn't care about these films too much. Dream Warriors. It's very beloved by a lot of the people, by a lot of its fan base, and I respect and understand that. But personally, the film lost me at Wizard Master. It just got so fucking goofy I couldn't take it seriously, and it stopped being a horror film for me. Dream Master, directed by Renee Harlin, who again kind of changed the mythology. In part 3, you can kill Freddy by burying his bones in consecrated ground. In Dream Master, you can kill him by showing him his reflection in a mirror. Oh, okay. Well, it's just that easy, apparently. But apparently not. He comes back in Dream Child, and I forget, something about his mom came back and absorbed the fetus that Freddy was going to possess. I forget. I've seen Dream Child probably the least out of any of the films in the franchise, maybe once or twice in my life. So memory's a little fuzzy on that one. Sorry. Freddy's Dead. I put this in a fractured timeline just because it takes place in a Springwood that is a couple of years in the future, at least in the release date of the film, like 10 years from whenever the hell this movie came out. I don't even remember. They kill him at the end. He had a daughter that nobody knew about. Elm Street, all the kids have been, or in Springwood, all the kids have been killed by Freddy, and all the adults are insane. And this one is much more overtly comedic than any of the films that came before, so that's why I'm putting it in a different timeline. The tone is so different. Again, very just a bungled project, very poorly handled, just very disappointing in general. But I guess at the end of this one, he winds up in hell. At the end, he's officially dead. I guess that's where they left off. So Freddy and Jason meet up in hell and have a battle in real life. And there's the little tag at the end of Freddy vs. Jason, which looks like it takes place in some kind of fantasy afterlife, like a Valhalla for serial killers, or something, where Jason walks out of the lake with Freddy's severed, winking head. Jason X, much like Manhattan, I don't really know where the hell it fits in the continuity, because Jason, he's in the real world and they caught him somehow and have him on ice in the future. So maybe that Valhalla Lake that Jason came out of at the end was reality. That's the only thing I have to go on. So yeah, a very, very fractured, bizarro continuity here from these two franchises back in the dark days when reboots were not a thing and people had to experiment in sequels, and everything's just all fucked up and fractured as a result. Maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to do reboots all across the board and start these things over again. I don't know. And if that happens, I would love to take a crack at Friday the 13th. If someone out there is listening, when Victor Miller settles the lawsuit and the rights are reverted, please